Hello, and welcome to this lecture on the orality of oral history. One of the most salient aspects of oral history is that it is spoken. Now, I don't mean to sound glib or trite, but speech, like writing, has its own internal logic, its own rules of grammar, its own mechanisms of communicating information, its own effect on memory, and its own rules of evidence, reliability, and validity. You and I live in a world of the written word, that is, a world of literacy. We have taken many classes to teach us how to read and write. We know that writing has its own logic, rules, and canons of communication. We use the written word to substitute for memory. You have learned historical methods to tease out the evidence and test the reliability and validity of written sources. People who operate in a primarily oral culture see the world differently than those of us operating in a primarily literate culture. Do not mistake the one for the other, even if they're both available to the people who you are interviewing. Do not judge the correctness of one above the other. Orality and literacy are different languages. Those differences are more profound than are the differences that separate English from French or German or any other language. There are qualities of orality that we should consider. Walter Ong, in his seminal work Orality and Literacy, discusses completely oral cultures. Nevertheless, what he talks about still applies to those cultures that we deal with, which are oral in one sense and literate in another sense. Ong notes that the sound of words themselves is of primary importance because, as he says, thought itself related in an altogether special way to sound. He also notes that spoken language precedes writing, and orality conveys richer meanings than writing. Writing commits words to space, while speaking commits words to time. Consequently, spoken language has fewer words than written language. Spoken language retains its meaning closer to what the speaker intended, while writing allows the speaker to superimpose his or her own meaning, regardless of the author's intent. Orality transmits knowledge differently than does written language. Social structures grow up around our various technologies. Orality is a technology, as is writing. Social structures change with the introduction of a new technology, and so social structures change when writing is introduced. Writing substitutes for the intimate character of information transmittal required in an oral culture. Ong talks of passing learning, for example, by apprenticeship for artisan occupations, and for intellectual occupations, discipleship. Both of these, apprenticeship and discipleship, that is, learning at the knee of the master, have been replaced in our lives by book learning. In fact, they're being replaced again as the book is being replaced by newer technologies like video and audio and, of course, the World Wide Web. To aid memory, oral transmission requires mnemonics. Thus we have poetry, proverbs, rhythm, repetition, ritual, rhetoric, which are specific rules for speaking, and the use of talisman. All of these embed the recounting of the event into consciousness and memory. For example, in his book From Memory to Written Record, M.T. Clancy writes that in medieval England, conveyances of land or conveyances of privilege was spoken before witnesses, and the recipient received a personal memento from the person making the gift to symbolize that larger gift and to aid the memories of everyone who was a witness. Knives were common talisman. Swords were common talisman, particularly for the granting of privileges, but even oddities like locks of hair that a lord might have cut off from his own head before all of these witnesses and then presented to the vassal were talisman of the gift as well. Oral evidence, according to Ong, is neither reliable nor accurate except when other witnesses attest to it. Now, these other witnesses saw the event happen or heard the retelling of the event. And again, remember, he's talking about completely oral cultures, cultures that have no writing at all. They have elaborate rules, generally speaking, for either the recounting of the stories or for the providing of information that is accurate and reliable. That is, other witnesses have to be present, or else these stories cannot be told. Ong also notes that orality limits what he calls sequential analysis that writing privileges. Thus, to him, oral literature is an oxymoron. However, what he says is that storytelling by specialists like the West African griots replaces what he thinks of as literature. So what does all of this mean for the oral historian? We tend to be literate. We diligently study written texts, and our minds are attuned to the rules of writing. As oral historians, we deal with people who recount their lives not as written texts. Many are literate in the sense of being able to read and write, at least moderately well, but they might not live in a predominantly literate culture. That is, one in which information is passed by the written word predominantly. They might live in a predominantly oral culture, in which the spoken word transmits information. If so, their worldview will differ from yours. How they deal with information will differ from the way you deal with information as well. So here's where your ability to actively listen comes into play. Ask yourself if the narrator you're working with is telling you the whole story, or if that person is restrained by trying to force their story into what we might call the canon of narration. That is, it has to have a plot, it has to make sense, there are characters, there has to be a denouement. They might be doing this in order to help them remember the events more accurately. Ask yourself if the narrator requires a talisman, mnemonics, or props to help them recount the story. And then, as we discussed in our last lecture, provide those talisman, mnemonics, and props to help them get their story onto the recording device. Lastly, but of great importance, understand that the world of orality and oral culture is different from the world of literacy and a culture based on literacy. This concludes this lecture discussing the orality of oral history, in which we discussed differences between oral and literate culture, and we discussed ways of thinking about those differences that will allow you to create better oral history interviews. As always, thank you very much for your attention.